friends, ADC here from another wonderful evening in the lowlands of Eastern Scotland. Today is the 27th of September 2018. Debt. Now, debt is quite a rich topic, and I definitely want to spend quite a few videos discussing it. But today I want to spend some time doing something relatively simple, namely distinguishing between private and public debt. Before we begin, borrowing is quite an important part of any economy, both for businesses and for citizens. Now, as a child, I always used to think, and always intuitively do still think, that borrowing is not a very good idea, since you will end up paying more for the same thing, and so essentially it's not very intelligent. However, there are certain situations, both for businesses and for the average citizen, where borrowing may either be impractical or more beneficial, or simply a much more intelligent thing to do. For example, if a business wants to expand, they need either new machinery or better machinery or a warehouse, etc., then they can borrow money as opposed to using their cash reserves, and that would A, be able to expand their business much quicker rather than waiting to save the money, and B, it would be less dangerous in terms of if the return is not as great or not as expected, then they will still be able to use the cash reserves to pay their employees, for example. Whereas for the average citizen, it might be impractical to save up many hundreds of thousands of pounds to buy a house, or if your car breaks down and you need one quickly and you do not have 10 grand to buy a new one, or even the 600 that are needed to buy a second-hand one, you can finance and then pay it slowly. Now, the main thing that I want to discuss then is what are the differences between public and private. So public debt is that of the government, whereas private debt is that from, say, credit cards or loans or mortgages, etc. The way it works as a private citizen, if, say, you need to buy this nice Lamborghini, then you would go to a lender, like a bank, and you would convince them to lend you some money, and you would use this as collateral. So if you stop paying for your loan, they would repossess your vehicle, for example. And it's the same thing for a business. Now, the amount of interest you pay, because every time you borrow money, you will need to pay a little bit more, and that's called interest. The interest is based on how much risk you bring to this transaction. So someone who has a profile, say a middle-aged person with a stable job, high income, a history of always having paid bills, they will have a much higher credit rating and therefore a lower interest to someone who has defaulted on loans before or doesn't have as high income, always been in and out of jobs, etc. Which is a bit paradoxical in the sense that people who have less will end up having even less. But that is the nature of borrowing money, and like it or not, is something that exists. So your history and your profile brings your credit rating, and you have a collateral if you don't pay your debts. In theory, also interest rates should be dictated by the market, as I said, by all these factors. But in practice, they are also controlled by the central bank, in the sense that the central bank has a certain base interest rate, which is that of how commercial banks borrow money from the central bank. But this is a story for another time that I would like to discuss in more detail. Yes. So, and how do you earn this interest? You essentially labor a little bit extra, as that you would have done, and you finance that interest by working essentially a little bit more. Now let's talk about public debt. So the government doesn't actually do anything in terms of the economy. They are administrators. So the way that they function is that they need to have money to pay for the services. And how do they raise money? Taxes, but also bonds. Most of the time, they will not be able to have either upfront the money to pay directly, like having reserves in the treasury, or they will run a deficit. And if they run a deficit, they will physically not have the money to pay for the services, and therefore they need to borrow. And these are called bonds, government bonds. Government bonds are sold on the bond market, and their price is dictated essentially by supply and demand. So if you would buy a £100 bond, then you would expect in 10 years' time to get 105, say, depending on what the yield is that day, which fluctuates because it is sold on a stock market. Now, the supply is based on how desperate the government needs money. So the more they pump out, because they need more, they will raise their yields, so more people are attracted to buying it. And demand is very much also controlled by rating agencies. So someone like Moody's or Standard & Poor would rate a certain government, say AAA, which would be the highest, I believe, which means that the government is very trustworthy in paying their debt back. So that decreases its cost, the cost of borrowing money, as more investors flock to that place because they trust it more. They see it more as a risk-free sort of investment. People, banks, and other governments like China buying about 7 to 8% of the US's debt, all invest in bonds in one way or another, if you have savings, of course. Now, one of the main differences is that this public debt does not have collateral. What is the collateral? There is no collateral. And it would be quite cheesy to say, well, you, the taxpayer, are the collateral. But it wouldn't be entirely true. Now, of course, if the government runs too many deficits and needs to pay back their interest, then of course you will need to cut either services, so pensions, education, health, or sell off some national assets, beaches, highways, airports. And we've seen that happen in Greece, for example. So with the new creditors agreement with the IMF, Greece has sold some islands and has sold airports to Deutsche Bank, I believe, and a whole pension reform was required. So pretty disastrous if the government doesn't pay back their loans. Essentially because there is no collateral. The collateral is anything that's public, which is not good, really. I have a few thoughts though about government borrowing. And the first one is that effectively a government bond is deferred taxation. What I mean by that? Essentially, if we were spending 100, wallops of money to pay for whatever service today, then we would be financing that with bonds which have interest, which means that in 10 years' time, we will need to pay 105. So that extra tax is effectively kicked down the road, and the can gets bigger. So my generation would be paying for the services that have been used 10 years ago, for example. So how moral would that be? That's my question. And the other implication is people who have savings and can buy bonds and get a return effectively tax people who do not have savings and cannot, because as I get a return from having bought a bond, someone else who is also a taxpayer who did not have savings is effectively paying a little bit extra taxes so they can pay my interest, which also leads to some dark, money flowing towards the top implications. Of course, one tiny drop doesn't really do much, but as a collective and with hundreds of years going down, or however long a government exists, might have quite a profound effect on this thing. So that's all that I wanted to say for today. My question that I want to ask is, should government be allowed to borrow at all? I mean, clearly it does need to finance somehow the services, but, and what are the alternatives? And the other thought I had was, lending and interest cannot be banned as a practice in general, mostly because you will simply just get a black market, which is loan sharks, and that would probably have much worse consequences than not just simply allowing borrowing and interest and finding a better way of doing things. It's a pretty long video today. If I got anything wrong, please put that in the comments. I'm open for any kind of discussion. This is just my thoughts. And ADC out. Kipusa. Pupo.